The audience laughed until they realized Keanu Reeves once. In front of millions, a talk show host mocked the one thing he never speaks about, his dead daughter. What happened next wasn't outrage, it was silence. And that silence shattered everything. What did Keanu do, and why did it change the world? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights in the studio burned bright, hotter than they looked on screen. The iconic skyline backdrop glowed behind the stage, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Rachel Lennox adjusted her blazer as the band played its closing notes. A polished veteran of late-night television, Rachel had built her brand on sharp wit, viral zingers, and the occasional controversy. Her show, After Dark with Rachel Lennox, was the kind that never failed to trend by morning. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage to roaring applause. He moved with the same quiet humility he always did, one hand offering a modest wave, the other in his pocket. Dressed in a black button-down and slacks, he looked every bit the movie star, but carried himself like anything but. Rachel rose from her chair and met him center stage with a smile that could cut glass. They exchanged a quick hug. Camera-friendly, safe. Then Keanu took his seat on the left side of the host's desk. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rachel began, her voice smooth and practiced, "the man who needs no introduction, Keanu Reeves." More applause. The audience leaned forward in their seats, phones hidden in their laps, eyes wide open. The camera panned to Keanu as he gave a small bow, then settled in. "Keanu," Rachel said, grinning as she shuffled her note cards, "you've had what, 20 lifetimes worth of careers? The Matrix, John Wick, cyberpunk messiah, motorcycle builder, bass guitarist. Are you secretly cloning yourself?" Keanu gave a soft chuckle. "No clones, just one day at a time." The audience laughed warmly. Rachel beamed. "And now this new sci-fi epic," she continued, gesturing to a clip they'd just shown. "You're a father trying to save his daughter's memory from a collapsing artificial world. A bit close to home, huh?" There was a pause. Keanu nodded, not smiling this time. "A little close, yeah. The script hit something real." The atmosphere in the room shifted, just slightly. Rachel noticed it, then quickly lightened her tone. "Well, we'll get into all the deep philosophy later," she said brightly. "First, I gotta ask the important stuff, like, what's the weirdest fan interaction you've had this month?" Keanu smiled again. "Someone in Tokyo gave me a potato with my face carved into it." The audience erupted with laughter. Rachel smirked. "The potato?" she repeated. Keanu shrugged. "It was surprisingly detailed." The studio laughed harder, the tension loosening again. Rachel leaned back in her chair, relaxing into her rhythm. For the next few minutes, the exchange was smooth. Keanu told a story about his dog stealing his breakfast, another about crashing a stranger's wedding in Italy by accident. Rachel volleyed back with jokes about how he was secretly the most polite action star Hollywood had ever known. The audience was eating it up. But somewhere in the flow of conversation, something shifted again. It was so subtle, only the most observant viewers, or the people in the studio that night, would have noticed. Rachel picked up a new cue card. Her smile didn't change, but something in her posture did. Her fingers tightened slightly. Her voice dropped half a pitch. Keanu, instinctively, straightened in his seat. "So, Keanu," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing in a way that wasn't immediately hostile but wasn't friendly either. "You've always had this mystique, right? The tragic past, the whole soulful wanderer thing. Does it ever feel like people only love you for the sadness you carry?" Keanu's face didn't change. He blinked once, twice. The crowd laughed, nervously this time. Rachel smiled wider and flipped to another card. And somewhere offstage, a camera assistant dropped their pen. Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, the kind of small movement that would go unnoticed in a less charged moment. But under the stage lights and in the hush that followed Rachel's latest question, every gesture carried weight. Rachel leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Her tone was playful on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it, a sharpness that suggested she wasn't finished pushing. Her eyes held a flicker of something more calculated now. Her producers in the control booth watched closely, one whispering into a headset. "So," she said, her voice low and amused, "you've talked in interviews about loss, about pain, about, what was it you said? Grief and love are forever linked? Beautiful stuff. But don't you think that gets a little over-romanticized?" A murmur moved through the audience. Not a laugh, not yet. Just the beginnings of discomfort. Keanu didn't flinch. He stared at the desk in front of him. His fingers brushed the edge of his coffee mug. Still silent. Rachel glanced out at the audience, reading the room, then pivoted. Okay, she said, chuckling. "Let's lighten up. Let's talk about your childhood. You've said you moved around a lot, didn't really have a stable home. That must have made you, good at pretending?" A single nervous laugh escaped from the back row. Keanu looked up. His gaze met Rachel's, steady, unreadable. He smiled, pressing on. "I mean, all those tragic stories, your dad leaving, losing your best friend, your partner, your daughter. It's like something out of a Greek myth. Sometimes I wonder if you really went through all that or if it's just the best PR backstory Hollywood ever wrote." The words hung in the air like smoke. The audience froze. Even the crew behind the cameras had stopped moving. The boom mic operator visibly stiffened. Keanu's jaw tightened, not in anger, but as if holding something back. He didn't respond, didn't blink, just looked at Rachel. She broke eye contact first. The control booth clicked through camera angles, looking for something, anything, to reset the tone. Then Rachel laughed, light and quick. Kidding, she said with a smirk, flipping to the next card like it meant nothing. "You know me, I poke, I prod, but I swear I do it with love." Her tone was breezy, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water. Keanu took a deep breath. Not loud, but enough that the microphone picked it up. He smiled gently. "There's truth in pain," he said quietly. Rachel blinked. And, he added, "Sometimes silence says more than words ever can." It was the first thing he'd said in nearly 2 full minutes, and it landed like a stone in a still pond. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent, so they did both. A few clapped, others just stared. Rachel gave a small, nervous chuckle. "Wow," she said, "deep. Okay then, let's talk about your motorcycle company. What's it called again? Arch?" Keanu nodded. She reached for another card, but her hand hovered a moment too long. The moment wasn't gone, it was just quiet now, waiting. And then she said it. "Actually, before we move on, I do have one more question. One the internet's been curious about for years." Keanu turned his head slowly toward her. Rachel's smile curled. Not warm, not cruel, just sharp. "Do you still cry over your imaginary daughter?" The crowd gasped. The room went still. Not the quiet that comes before a joke lands, but the silence that follows a punch you didn't see coming. Keanu didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his eyebrows. He didn't frown. He just looked down at the table between them. Rachel gave a quick laugh, sharp and performative. "Oh, come on, Keanu, I'm just teasing." She turned toward the audience, adding in a louder voice, "You know, the whole Hollywood saint thing, sad eyes, tragic past. I'm just saying, maybe it's really good acting." This time, the audience didn't laugh. Not a single person clapped. A few exchanged glances. One woman near the front row slowly rose from her chair and walked toward the exit, shaking her head. Rachel's smile faltered. Keanu still hadn't moved. His hand, resting on his knee, gently reached toward the necklace beneath his shirt. He touched it, barely, like it carried a memory. Another man in the crowd stood. He whispered something to his wife, and they both walked out. Rachel looked around, eyes wide, for a split second before she forced another smirk. Okay, she said quickly. You guys are tense tonight. Relax. We're just having fun. No one responded. The studio no longer buzzed with energy. It buzzed with something else. Discomfort. Regret. And Keanu, finally, raised his head. Still calm, still composed, but behind his eyes was something deeper than anger. He looked directly at Rachel and said nothing. And in that silence, something irreversible had already begun. For a full 3 seconds, nothing moved. Not Keanu. Not the audience. Not even Rachel. The lights above the stage felt suddenly harsher, like a spotlight turned interrogation lamp. Keanu's hand rested lightly over the cross beneath his shirt, unmoving. His eyes were still cast downward, but his entire body seemed to radiate a different kind of stillness now. Not passive, not peaceful, just present. Deeply, painfully present. The audience wasn't sure what to do. Someone let out a single awkward chuckle, quickly smothered. A man near the back shifted in his seat, eyes darting to the exit sign. Another woman covered her mouth, as if she'd just witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Rachel glanced at the camera, then back at Keanu. The silence dragged on. She fidgeted with her pen, flipping it once between her fingers like it was suddenly too heavy. Well, she said lightly, attempting to smile. I didn't mean to strike a nerve. Keanu didn't respond. She cleared her throat and leaned forward again. Come on, Keanu, she said in a tone that was half teasing, half nervous. It's not like I made that up. You've talked about grief, loss, trauma, tragedy. You practically invented the genre. I'm just saying, if we're supposed to believe all that, maybe we're allowed to ask if it's real. Still no response. Just the quiet hum of studio lights and the increasingly uncomfortable shifting of bodies in the crowd. Rachel pushed forward. I mean, don't get me wrong, she said with a forced grin. You play it well. The grieving father, the haunted lover, the broken hero. It's beautiful. It really is. But maybe, just maybe, it's all part of the character. Maybe it's not grief. Maybe it's branding. Another sharp silence. Rachel chuckled again, but it was thinner now. She turned to the crowd. Right? She said. I mean, it's Hollywood. You gotta sell a story. But the crowd wasn't with her anymore. One by one, heads began to lower. A few audience members avoided eye contact with the stage. A camera operator slowly stepped back from his position, careful not to knock over anything. Then Keanu finally looked up. Slow, controlled, measured. His eyes weren't red. They weren't angry. They were just quiet. Too quiet. He looked directly at Rachel, as if seeing something far beyond her face. Rachel opened her mouth again, about to say something else, but the words caught in her throat. Keanu held her gaze, then looked past her, past the camera, past the crowd, as if his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere darker. Somewhere sacred. And just like that, the laughter died. Rachel tried to laugh again. Okay, tough crowd tonight. But no one joined her. Even the applause sign overhead stayed dim. She shifted in her seat and picked up another cue card, trying to play it off. All right, let's pivot, yeah? She said. You're working on a new sci-fi movie. Post-apocalyptic world, right? AI, grief, memory, all that heavy stuff you love. But the moment had already changed everything, and Rachel knew it. Rachel set the cue card back down without reading it. For the first time in a long time, her usual rhythm had failed her. No recovery laugh, no sarcastic deflection, no clever pivot could unring the bell of what she'd just said. She looked at Keanu again, this time with less certainty, Less performance, more hesitation. Keanu sat still, posture calm, hands loosely clasped on his knee. His silence wasn't hollow. It was full of something the room couldn't name, but everyone could feel. Rachel reached for her water, took a sip, and set it down too quickly. The glass rattled against the desk, just loud enough to be heard. "Look," she said, her voice slightly softer. "I know you've been through a lot. I wasn't trying to be cruel, People talk, Keanu. They wonder. Some say you're too good to be true, too sad, too quiet, that maybe it's an act." Keanu's eyes didn't leave hers. Then, gently, he spoke. "It's not an act." His voice was steady, not loud, but anchored, like it came from somewhere unshakable. Rachel blinked. "Some things," Keanu continued, "don't need to be proven." He leaned forward slightly. "Some names don't belong in punchlines." The air in the studio thickened. One woman in the audience placed her hand over her heart. A man 2 rows behind her reached down for his coat. Another quiet exit. Rachel looked like she wanted to respond. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. Then came the laughter. Not from the crowd, from Rachel. It slipped out, nervous and tight. She gestured around the room, as if trying to reset the mood by force. Okay, now you're making me look like the bad guy," she said with a nervous grin. "I mean, you're Saint Keanu, right? Hollywood's holy man? You meditate, you don't raise your voice, you give away your paycheck. You're basically grief personified in a nice suit." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on. "But maybe," she said, eyes darting toward the camera, "maybe you've just gotten really good at making sadness look noble." Keanu sat back in his seat. He didn't smile, didn't frown. His hands rested on the arms of the chair now, relaxed. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it looks noble to you because you've never had to live with it." The words landed hard. Rachel didn't have a comeback for that, and the audience didn't make a sound. The hum of the control room could be heard faintly over the microphones. A producer in the booth leaned forward and whispered, "Cut to commercial?" Another voice responded, "No, not yet." Back on stage, Rachel tried again. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Keanu," she said, more sincerely now. "I'm trying to understand." Keanu looked down again, then slowly back up. "There's nothing to understand," he said. "Some things hurt. That's all." It was the kind of statement that sounded too simple to be deep. Until you heard the way he said it. Rachel looked down at her cue cards. For once, she had no idea which one to pick. And for the first time in her career, she realized it might not matter. Because something inside her was starting to shift. A strange hush settled over the studio. It wasn't the quiet of boredom or technical delay. It was the kind of stillness that comes when people feel they've crossed a line, when they realize too late that what they thought was content was actually something sacred. Rachel didn't speak. Her jaw tightened slightly as she placed the last cue card face down, her hands folded over it, knuckles pale from pressure. She wasn't sure if she was angry, embarrassed, or simply exposed. Keanu looked toward the audience now. Not to accuse them, not to seek validation, but to include them. His gaze was steady, level, human. The crowd returned it, their expressions softened. No one reached for their phones. No one spoke. Rachel shifted again in her chair and broke the silence, but this time with something barely audible. "I didn't know she was real," she whispered. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply nodded once. "She was," he said, "and she still is." The sentence struck harder than any raised voice ever could. Rachel's eyes dropped to the desk. Her fingers tapped once, twice, then stopped. Somewhere in the back of the studio, a soft sob broke the silence. It came from a crew member, someone who had seen 100 episodes and never once cried behind the lens. Keanu stood. He didn't storm off. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted the sleeves of his jacket and looked back at Rachel, his tone unchanged. "You don't have to understand my grief," he said, "but you don't get to laugh at it." Then he turned, nodded to the crew, and walked off stage. Not a single person clapped. Not because they didn't care, but because it felt wrong to interrupt the truth with applause. Keanu reached for the necklace beneath his shirt and touched it gently, just 2 fingers, barely brushing the small silver cross that lay against his chest. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for the audience. It was for her, his daughter, the one he had never spoken about in detail, not publicly, not even when asked directly in interviews. The one whose name rarely left his lips because some names, once spoken, carried too much weight. The silence in the studio expanded. Rachel Lennox remained seated behind her desk, her hands still folded over the cue cards she hadn't dared read. Her eyes flickered to the cameras, then to the audience, then back to Keanu. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, his hand resting on the cross, his face composed in a way that made the room ache. The audience didn't know what to do. They didn't know if they were supposed to clap, laugh, shift, cough, or remain still. So most of them did nothing at all. Then a woman near the 3rd row stood up. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a tight line. She shook her head slowly as she reached for her purse. Without a word, she turned and walked out. Another person followed. Then another. There was no outrage, no shouting, just quiet disobedience. People making a choice, not to protest, but to leave. To remove themselves from the moment, like they didn't want to be complicit in what was happening. Rachel tried to reclaim control. "Tough crowd tonight," she said with a forced chuckle. "Guess I need to rewrite my material." The joke landed flat. She picked up her water glass and took a long sip. The ice had melted. She looked back at Keanu. "Okay," she said, "let's hit reset. Start fresh. We'll get back to the fun stuff." But it was too late. Everyone knew it. The moment had passed, and something heavier had taken its place. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, resting his arms on the sides of the chair, posture still open. Not guarded, just grounded. He slowly lifted his gaze from the floor and locked eyes with Rachel. The control room cut to a tight camera angle on his face. It was the kind of expression people remembered, not for its emotion, but for its restraint. The kind of look you see in someone who's lived through something that changed them forever. Rachel sat frozen. For the first time in her long career, the silence on her set wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic effect. It wasn't a beat in the rhythm of the show. It was real, unscripted, and completely out of her control. She tried to smile, but her mouth barely moved. Her voice, usually so sharp and confident, was suddenly quiet. "I didn't mean," she began, but trailed off. Keanu didn't blink. He didn't glare. He simply watched her. The moment stretched. The audience, unsure of what would happen next, remained still. No one whispered. No one rustled popcorn bags. Phones stayed tucked away. It was as if they were all afraid to interrupt something sacred. Rachel tapped her pen nervously against the desk. "I mean, come on," she said, her tone rising into a nervous laugh. "This is what we do here. We push. We poke. We dig a little." Another attempt to lighten the mood. It didn't land. The man near the front row stood slowly, nodded respectfully toward Keanu, and exited the studio. Rachel tried again. "I thought you, of all people, could handle it," she said, voice thinner now. "You're the guy who never cracks. The calm one. The one who walks through fire and doesn't even flinch." Keanu looked down for a moment. Then he sat back in his chair and spoke for the first time in what felt like forever. His voice was quiet, clear, and shaken. "Some names," he said, "deserve silence, not jokes." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed like a weight in the chest. The camera cut to Rachel. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but no sound came. Then the camera cut back to Keanu. His face didn't hold anger. It held something more dangerous: dignity. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It was grace, wrapped in pain, delivered with the kind of presence that made the entire room feel like they were suddenly standing in a cathedral. Rachel cleared her throat, desperate now to move on. "Let's talk about your film," she said, flipping a card. "You've got that big release coming next month." But her words faded before they even reached the end of the sentence, because Keanu had looked away again. Not in retreat, but in refusal. He wasn't going to help her rebuild the broken moment. He wasn't going to offer her a lifeline. He wasn't going to pretend it didn't happen. And so the burden remained in her lap, heavy and sharp. She adjusted the mic on her collar, fidgeted with her sleeve. No applause came. No laughter. Just that growing tension in the air, like something had snapped beneath the surface, and no one knew how to fix it. The camera zoomed out slowly, capturing the entire set in one wide shot. Keanu sat like stone, but not cold. There was warmth in his stillness. Pain, yes, but also mercy, as if he had been here before. As if he had learned that the most powerful response to cruelty wasn't fury, it was presence. Rachel shifted in her seat again. Her hands were stiff, her grip on the cue cards tighter now. They were just paper, but they suddenly felt like anchors. Things she didn't know how to hold or release. Her breath was shallow, the laughter, the rhythm, the script. It had all slipped through her fingers. She opened her mouth, tried to find a new sentence, something that might stitch the moment back together. But nothing came, because there was nothing to say. Keanu remained in place, hands resting on his knees, shoulders relaxed. But there was a gravity to him now, a silence so full, it pressed into every corner of the room. It wasn't judgment, it wasn't superiority, it was simply truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need explaining. A woman in the second row wiped a tear from her cheek. A few others followed suit, not sobbing, not loud, just a quiet, shared ache. Rachel finally whispered something. "I didn't know she was real." Her voice cracked. Keanu didn't respond immediately. When he did, it wasn't to correct her. It wasn't to defend. It was simply to affirm. "She was," he said softly, "and she still is." He placed one hand over the cross at his chest again and held it there, not as a symbol for the audience, but as something private, something that belonged only to him and the little girl the world had never met. The air thickened with emotion, unspoken but deeply understood. Rachel stared at the desk. Her hands shook slightly, her fingertips pressed into the edge of the cue card, bending it at the corner. "I thought," she started, then stopped. She swallowed. "I thought you were untouchable." Keanu looked at her again. "No one is." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was gentle, heavy with experience, and devastatingly honest. Then, in one fluid motion, Keanu reached for the small microphone clipped to his collar. He unhooked it, set it gently on the table, and stood up. There was no music, no announcement, no fanfare. He just stood. Rachel didn't try to stop him. She didn't speak again. Keanu adjusted the sleeves of his jacket, gave a small nod to the audience, then turned toward the curtain behind the stage, and walked off. No rush, no retreat. Just quiet, deliberate movement. A few people in the crowd stood too, as if moved by instinct. They didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They followed with their eyes, respectfully, silent. And for a long time after he disappeared from view, no one moved. Not Rachel, not the crew, not the audience. Even the stage lights, once so bright and energetic, seemed dimmer now. The energy had shifted. Something sacred had passed through the room, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Rachel remained seated behind her desk. Her mouth parted slightly, like she might speak again, but the words didn't come. And for the first time in a career built on monologues and momentum, she realized that no reaction, no punchline, was stronger than this silence. The only sound left was the low hum of the studio lights. Steady, indifferent. And in that moment, everyone finally understood the weight of what had been said. Or rather, what hadn't. The moment Keanu disappeared behind the curtain, the room didn't return to normal. But it couldn't. No band kicked in. No applause sign blinked. No smooth voice from the announcer booth came through to lighten the tension. Rachel Lennox remained seated behind her desk, staring at the space Keanu had just walked out of. The silence had a pulse now. It wasn't still, it was loud, echoing through every person who sat in that studio. Not because they were shocked by what Keanu had said, but because they were confronted by what they hadn't. It started slowly. The woman in the third row, the one who had wiped away a tear, stood up. She looked around, then gently pushed her chair in and made her way toward the exit. Her steps were deliberate, her face composed. She didn't look at Rachel. A man in the front row followed her, grabbing his coat and nodding silently to a stagehand as he passed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His exit was the message. Then another, and another, until nearly 24 audience members were leaving, not in protest, not in chaos, but in quiet refusal. Refusal to continue clapping. Refusal to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something deeply wrong. Rachel tried to recover. She flipped through her cue cards, each one now meaningless. "Okay," she said, voice trembling. "I know that got heavy. Let's talk about the new movie." She forced a smile toward the remaining audience. "You all saw the trailer, right? Big-budget sci-fi, post-apocalyptic stuff. Keanu's character is trying to upload his daughter's memories into a machine." She trailed off. No one responded. A camera operator hesitated behind the lens, unsure which direction to pan. A stage manager whispered into a headset, "Do we cut to commercial?" No answer came. Rachel picked up her water glass again and took a long sip. Her hands were shaking. "I mean, the film's about memory, right?" she continued, her tone higher now, trying to sound upbeat. "Loss, legacy, all that important dramatic stuff. So, yeah." She looked at the spot where Keanu had been sitting. The empty chair stared back at her like a reminder. She cleared her throat. "He told me backstage that he helped shape the character, said it reminded him of someone. He didn't say who, but I guess it makes sense now." The audience remained still. A few heads turned toward the door. Rachel pressed her fingers into her temples just for a second, then looked up again with a flicker of forced energy. "But, come on," she said, attempting a light laugh. "We've all made awkward jokes before. That doesn't mean we're monsters, right?" No one laughed, because this wasn't about a joke anymore. It was about the space that had been violated, the grief that had been trivialized, and the man who had responded not with rage, but with stillness. That's what made it unforgettable. Not the insult, but the silence that followed. Behind the scenes, the crew was beginning to unravel. The control booth, normally filled with fast commands and calm coordination, had gone quiet. The producers watched the monitor in stunned silence, unsure what to cut to. The floor director stood frozen near the edge of the stage, headset in place, mouth slightly open, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. No one had ever seen Rachel lose a room like this. Not once. She was known for riding the line. Edgy, unpredictable, brilliant at spinning awkward moments into viral clips. But this wasn't awkward. This wasn't TV friction. This was something different. And it was happening live. The assistant stage manager whispered into her headset, "Should we send out the band?" The reply came after a long pause. "Not yet." Rachel took another breath and smiled stiffly into the camera. "Well, if you're just tuning in, Keanu Reeves was here, briefly." A few people in the audience exchanged glances. She tried to chuckle. "Okay, I know I came on a little strong, but look, you know me. I ask what no one else will. I say what people are thinking. That's what makes a good interview, right?" Still no applause. Her hands fidgeted beneath the desk. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she kept talking. "We've got more guests tonight," she said quickly. "Plenty of laughs still ahead. Don't go anywhere." But everyone knew they already had. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally, spiritually, something had already broken off and drifted away from her. The camera cut to a close-up of Keanu's empty chair, then to the necklace he had left behind. No one noticed him take it off. No one saw when he placed it gently on the seat before walking away. But now it sat there in plain view, catching the stage light just enough to gleam. The cross was small, unadorned, but it held the entire weight of the moment. Rachel stared at it, then looked away. Someone backstage handed her a new cue card. She barely glanced at it before setting it down. A faint cough came from the audience, then silence again. Finally, a single camera slowly zoomed in, not on the host, not on the desk, but on that silver cross. And suddenly, the image was everywhere. On television screens, on live streams. It's clipped and shared in real time. People watching at home sat up straighter. They weren't watching a segment anymore. They were witnessing a fracture, a moment when the mask cracked. Not Keanu's. Hers? The camera lingered on the silver cross for a full 8 seconds. It was longer than most directors would allow, but no one called for a cut. The silence was so complete, it felt like part of the script, even though it wasn't. No one in the booth said anything. No one dared to. Because for the first time in the show's history, the moment had swallowed the production. The silver cross sat on the chair like a quiet rebuke. Not theatrical, not dramatic, just present. The symbol didn't need context. It didn't need words. The audience stared at it. The viewers at home stared at it. Even the crew behind the scenes, still wearing their headsets and clinging to their checklists, stopped moving. The world was holding its breath. Rachel Lennox sat motionless, her fingers interlocked on the desk now, cue cards forgotten. The desk had never felt more useless. It had always been her fortress, her control panel, her stage. Now it was just a slab of wood between her and something she no longer understood. Her throat tightened. She reached again for the water glass, then pulled her hand back before touching it. The applause sign blinked once, then again, but no one responded. Finally, the light was turned off. Someone in the control booth whispered, "We've lost the crowd." But they hadn't just lost the crowd. They'd lost the moment, and everyone knew it. Rachel's eyes were drawn again to the chair, to the glint of the cross under the lights. It looked impossibly small, and yet it had managed to shift the entire atmosphere. The band sat still. The teleprompter paused. Time moved, but the show did not. Rachel inhaled, slow and uneven, and turned toward the camera, not the wide shot, the direct one. The one that always caught her at her sharpest, her most in control. But tonight, it caught something else. "I know what this show is supposed to be," she said quietly. "Fast, funny, a little dangerous." She glanced at the cue cards. "But tonight," she trailed off, then started again. "Tonight, I think I forgot the line between dangerous and disrespectful." There was a murmur in the audience. Not disapproval. Recognition. Rachel leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice no longer theatrical. "When someone like Keanu Reeves walks into this space, we assume he's built for this, that he's used to it, that he's a statue we can decorate with our assumptions and still expect him to smile." She looked at the empty chair. But he wasn't a statue tonight. He was a father, a man. She paused, voice thinning. And I mocked that? No one clapped. No one cheered. No one moved to console her. But that was the point. It wasn't time to perform anymore. She turned back to the camera. Not to spin it, not to recover her brand, just to say something true. "I thought silence was emptiness. I thought it was dead air. But it turns out it can be the loudest thing in the world." She closed her eyes for a beat. And when she opened them again, she didn't look like a talk show host. She looked like someone who had been publicly, painfully humbled. "I don't know what happens next," she said, "but I know we can't pretend this didn't happen." She looked once more at the cross, then at the curtain Keanu had disappeared behind. "And maybe," she added, "we shouldn't." The screen faded to black. Not because the show was over, but because the story was already beginning to outgrow the stage. The episode hadn't even finished airing when the first clip hit social media. A fan in the audience had been recording from their seat. The angle was slightly tilted, a bit shaky, but it captured everything. The moment Rachel Lennox asked the cruel question, Keanu's motionless reaction, and the slow, powerful lift of his hand to the necklace beneath his shirt. The video spread like fire. First, it was uploaded to a private story. Then it got reshared. Then again. And again. Within 20 minutes, a Twitter post with the caption, "This is how you carry grief," had already reached over 100,000 views. By the time Rachel's studio cut to commercial, the hashtag "Some Names Deserve Silence" was climbing the trending list. People weren't just watching, they were reacting. TikTok exploded with reaction videos. Some angry, some emotional, others quietly stunned. Influencers who usually joked through their content sat in near silence, watching the moment unfold, frame by frame. "Look at how he doesn't flinch," one creator whispered in a stitched video. "He doesn't clap back, he doesn't walk off in rage, he just holds it. Like it's sacred." Another creator, known for trauma therapy content, paused the video at the exact moment Keanu touched his necklace. "This," she said, "this is the posture of someone who still talks to the dead, who keeps them close, not in stories but in gestures." By midnight, the clip had over 18 million views across platforms. People didn't call it a breakdown. They called it a reckoning. Podcasters who had already planned out their weekend episodes tore up their outlines. One opened his mic and said, "I've interviewed dozens of celebrities. I've seen them dodge hard questions with jokes. I've seen them explode. But I've never seen anyone respond like this." He didn't say much, but man, did he say everything. Screenshots of the silver cross went viral on Instagram. A post with the caption, "When someone leaves you with nothing but a memory, you learn to protect it with silence," became the most reshared story of the night. There were memes, but not mocking ones. They didn't distort his image. They amplified it. Side-by-side images of Keanu looking down, hand to heart, were paired with words like grace, stillness, and real strength doesn't need noise. Even late-night competitors began issuing vague tweets. One host wrote, "Some moments aren't interviews, they're mirrors." Another posted, "Tonight wasn't entertainment, it was a lesson." Rachel's account went silent. Her team issued no response. But silence was no longer her ally. It belonged to him now. The moment had shifted ownership. From the stage to the world. And the world wasn't done watching. By the time the East Coast went to bed, the story was no longer just viral. It was cultural. Teachers were sending the clip to each other in group chats with captions like, "This is what dignity looks like." A grief counselor in Chicago shared it to her clients with the note, "Watch how he carries pain. Not to protect himself, but to honor what was lost." Hashtags multiplied. Some names deserve silence. Keanu Reeves was right. Faith is not a prop. Grief is not content. A still image of Keanu sitting silently, hand resting over his chest, became the default for hundreds of posts, and every single one carried the same tone. Not shock, not scandal. Respect. People weren't canceling Rachel Lennox, they were bypassing her entirely. The story didn't need a villain anymore. It had a center, and that center was a man who had refused to turn his loss into a weapon. The clip was analyzed like a historical moment. Media students slowed it down. Body language experts explained his posture, his eye movements, the way he never broke or performed. "See how he doesn't fill the silence?" one expert explained. "Most people rush to respond. He doesn't. That's presence. That's someone who's made peace with the uncomfortable." Celebrities began weighing in. A famous actress tweeted, "He didn't defend. He didn't attack. He just remembered. And we felt it." A well-known director posted, "This wasn't about being insulted. This was about watching a sacred thing be mocked and choosing to stay grounded anyway." Even people who didn't normally speak on these things, athletes, chefs, fashion designers, shared the clip. Not because they wanted clout, because they had been there, because they had been mocked for mourning, because they had been told to get over it. And watching Keanu refuse to turn his grief into a punchline gave them permission to stop justifying theirs. Meanwhile, comment sections were flooded. Thousands of people shared their own stories. "I lost my daughter 2 years ago. I've never told anyone because they said I should move on. My father passed last fall. I've been silent because I didn't want to make people uncomfortable. Watching this made me feel seen. My baby lived 12 days. I've been pretending I was fine, until tonight." Keanu hadn't asked for any of it. He hadn't planned it. But somehow, in his silence, people found space for their own. Even therapists joined in. A video from a hospice grief specialist went viral overnight. She sat with her laptop open, watching the moment where Keanu said, "Some names deserve silence." Then she closed the laptop and turned to the camera. "No one had said it like that before," she whispered. "But it's true. Some names aren't meant for jokes. They're meant for memory, for reverence." She paused. "And for the first time in my career, I think the internet just got it." As morning broke on the West Coast, the network scrambled. Producers held emergency meetings. Executives called PR firms. Publicists reached out to Keanu's team for statements, interviews, exclusives, but they got nothing. No comment, no tweet, no Instagram story. Keanu remained silent. And that silence only made the moment stronger. Because now, the world wasn't just reacting. It was reflecting. One news anchor, visibly emotional, opened their morning broadcast not with the headlines, but with the viral clip. They let it play in full, then looked into the camera and said, "If you've ever been laughed at while grieving, this moment is for you." And across platforms, more voices joined. A pastor posted the clip with a caption, "Even Jesus wept." A poet wrote, "We used to think grief had to shout. Now we've seen it whisper and command the room." In the middle of it all, a teenage boy in Oregon posted a shaky video of himself in his bedroom, holding a drawing he made after watching the clip. It was a sketch of Keanu, seated in silence, his hand over his heart. Beside him, the boy had drawn a second chair with the name of his sister, who had died 5 years earlier. He whispered to the camera, "Now I know I can say her name," without laughing it away. It got 3 million views in 2 hours. Because it wasn't content anymore. It was communion. The moment had moved beyond celebrity, beyond controversy. It had become a kind of mirror. Not everyone liked what they saw, but no one could look away. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, Keanu's official public relations team posted a single image on his verified social media accounts. No caption, no statement, no explanation. Just a photograph. A folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly at the edges, sat on a smooth, dark table. The same table from the interview the night before. The lighting was soft, the composition minimal. Nothing else was visible in the frame. No signature, no handwriting revealed, just the creased edge of the paper, worn from being opened and closed over time. Treasured, touched, protected. People recognized the setting immediately. It was the stage. Rachel Lennox's set. The same surface where Keanu had sat the night before, unmoving, unflinching, while the world watched him endure something it would take others a lifetime to understand. The post exploded within minutes. The image was reshared hundreds of thousands of times across Instagram, X, Facebook, Threads, but no one asked what the letter said. They didn't need to, because in the context of what had just happened, everyone knew. It was hers, his daughter's, the last letter she ever wrote him. And now, without saying a word, he had placed it between himself and the host, between pain and spectacle, between love and mockery, and let it speak. He hadn't read it aloud. He hadn't even unfolded it. He didn't have to. Its presence had been enough. Now the world saw it too, and something happened. People stopped shouting. They started sharing. In the comments beneath the post, stories began flooding in. I have my brother's last voicemail saved on a USB drive. I haven't listened to it in 3 years. But I carry it with me everywhere. I keep my mother's favorite scarf in my coat pocket. I touch it whenever I feel like I'm disappearing. My daughter's last drawing sits taped inside my wallet. No one knows. Until now. A movement was born. But it wasn't loud. It was reverent. People began posting their keepsakes, their fragments of memory, their grief, not as content, but as connection, not performative, personal. They'd posted photos of old letters, ticket stubs, baby socks, journals, Polaroids, each with the same phrase beneath it. Some names deserve silence. That one sentence had become something else now. Not just a quote, a banner, a language, a place people could finally gather, not to be seen, but to remember. The image of Keanu's letter began appearing in places no one expected. It wasn't just on celebrity pages or trending timelines. It appeared in the stories of nurses coming off night shifts, in the feeds of school teachers between classes, on the dashboards of delivery drivers waiting at red lights. And the comment threads didn't fill with debate. They filled with testimony. People shared what they'd never had space to speak aloud. My son passed away when he was 4. I've never told anyone at work. I still keep his stuffed giraffe under my desk. I lost my twin sister 15 years ago. This morning, for the first time, I told my husband. I didn't know I was allowed to keep remembering. There were no arguments, no politics, no sides, just people finally telling the truth of what they carried. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a hospice worker from North Carolina uploaded a short video. It was filmed in a dim, quiet kitchen just after sunrise. She sat at her table in scrubs, holding an old photograph of her mother. I watched that clip last night, she said, and then I saw the letter this morning. I've been a hospice nurse for 22 years. I've seen death every week of my life, but I still cry when I remember the day I lost her. Her voice cracked. Not because I'm weak, but because I still love her. She held up the photo and smiled. Thank you, Keanu, for reminding us that pain is not the enemy. Within hours, her video had over 5 million views. People stitched it, duetted it, shared it quietly without commentary. Not because it was entertainment, but because it felt like healing. The letter never opened, never read, had somehow said more than any post, any headline, any apology ever could. Because it wasn't just a message from Keanu's past. It was a door, and people were walking through it. Rachel Lennox remained silent. Her team declined requests for interviews. No new episode of her show aired that night. Her accounts were still active, but inactive. No comments, no likes, no response. But by then, it didn't matter. The moment was no longer about her. It had moved on. People weren't discussing how wrong she was anymore. They were sharing how much they had held in, how often they had hidden their grief behind humor, how many times they'd laughed through funerals, smiled through anniversaries, swallowed tears to avoid making others uncomfortable. And now, suddenly, none of it felt necessary. They weren't being asked to perform anymore. They were being invited to feel. That night, something unusual happened in downtown Los Angeles. It began with just two people. A couple in their 50s, standing quietly outside the studio where the interview had been filmed. The woman held a small white candle. The man carried a single daisy and a folded sheet of paper in his coat pocket. They said nothing. They didn't bring signs. They just stood. 15 minutes later, a teenager on a bicycle stopped nearby. He didn't speak either. He lit a candle using the woman's flame, then sat cross-legged on the pavement. By 9:00 p.m., there were 30 people. By midnight, over 200. Some came with photos tucked into coat sleeves. Others arrived empty-handed, but full of memories. One woman brought an old music box. It played a soft, haunting lullaby. She left it on the steps and walked away. No one spoke loudly. They whispered, prayed, cried. A man in his 70s passed around blank note cards and pens, inviting people to write down a name they carried. Not for display, just to hold in their hands. One card read, "Elena, my daughter, stillborn, 1983. Another said, "Danny, brother, AIDS, 1992. I never told anyone." Third, "Sophie, my best friend, suicide. I miss her every morning." No one asked for cameras, but they came anyway. And this time, they didn't push forward or shout questions. They stood behind the crowd, lenses lowered, unsure whether to film. It felt sacred. Someone taped a printout of Keanu's letter image on the studio door. Below it, a handwritten message in black ink. We carried them with us, always. The message spread. By morning, hundreds of similar vigils had sprung up across the country, in hospital parking lots, on college campuses, outside high school gyms, at old train stations and rural bus stops. Everywhere people had once said goodbye. People who had never met each other now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by the quiet ache they'd hidden for years. Some vigils included music. Others simply stood in silence for 9 minutes, the length of Keanu's stillness during the show. A few participants brought folded letters and placed them in baskets, anonymously. No one opened them. They didn't need to. The act of folding was the statement. And somewhere between grief and grace, something was healing. Not because a celebrity had said something powerful, but because he had chosen not to speak, to let memory stand untouched, to let the moment breathe. The next morning, Keanu's team made one final post. No image of Keanu. No video. Just a black background with 5 simple words in white. Grief is not weakness. It is proof that we loved. No caption. No hashtags. It's truth. And for once, the internet didn't respond with sarcasm or speculation. It responded with reverence. People shared the post and tagged no one. He simply wrote, "For my father, for my wife, for my child." And in doing so, they reminded each other, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that love does not disappear when someone dies. It lives on, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes in a single folded letter placed gently on a table. And that was enough. Rachel Lennox hadn't left her dressing room in 18 hours. The world outside was unraveling. Her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. News anchors used the word disgraced. Hashtags calling for her resignation were multiplying every hour. But inside the quiet of her private space, all Rachel could hear was her own laugh, blooping in her head, like a cruel echo she couldn't shut off. She sat on the velvet couch that once felt luxurious, now rough and cold against her skin. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Texts from producers, emails from publicists, voicemails from sponsors. They all said the same thing. We need a statement. But Rachel couldn't find her voice. On her vanity table, the cue cards from the show still sat in a neat pile. The one with the question, the line that destroyed everything, was face up. She had written it herself, proud of its bite. Back then it felt clever, daring, viral. Now it looked like a confession. "Do you still cry over your imaginary daughter?" she said. She stared at the ink, unable to look away. Her hands trembled, her breath shortened. The air in the room felt thick. A knock came at the door. Her assistant's voice followed, soft and hesitant. "Rachel, your team's here. They're asking if you want to film a response, just whenever you're ready." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't move. On the coffee table sat a cup of tea, cold now, unfinished. Beside it, a framed photo no one had ever seen. It had fallen out of her bag when she first stormed into the room and hadn't been touched since. It was a picture of a little girl, 7 years old, curly red hair, toothless grin, sitting on Rachel's lap. Her name was Mia. Rachel reached for the photo with shaking hands. Her fingers brushed the glass frame as if touching something fragile. She hadn't spoken Mia's name in years. Not publicly, not privately, not even to herself. It was buried, locked away under decades of work, sarcasm, and spotlights. When Mia died, Rachel was 28 and hosting a small local show in Detroit. She'd taken 2 weeks off, then returned to set with a forced smile and tighter scripts. She told herself she'd grieve later. That professionalism was armor, that strength meant silence. But now, silence was swallowing her. She played the clip again on her tablet. The moment. The question. The pause. Keanu's face. The necklace. The words. Some names deserve silence, not jokes. His voice was so calm. Not angry, not wounded, just still. Rachel dropped the tablet onto the floor. Her knees buckled as she slid to the carpet, the photo of Mia clutched in her hands. The tears came suddenly. Messy, choking sobs she couldn't stop. Not soft, dignified tears, but the kind that twist your stomach and collapse your chest. Her mascara ran down her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she whispered her daughter's name aloud for the first time in over 20 years. Mia. Down the hallway, the studio was unusually quiet. Staff members moved in hushed tones. The familiar clatter of heels, laughter, and prep chatter had vanished. No one dared speak Rachel's name above a whisper. Her executive producer stood in the control room, staring at a blank monitor. She had seen controversies before, but this wasn't a bad headline or a political gaffe. This was different. It felt like something had broken, and not just in the public eye, but inside Rachel herself. Sponsors were already pulling out. 3 had withdrawn by mid-morning. By the end of the day, it would be 7. Phone calls kept coming in. Legal teams were scrambling. Publicists sent draft statements to Rachel's inbox, each carefully worded and painfully hollow. One draft began with, "We deeply regret the moment aired last night. It does not reflect our values." Another avoided naming Keanu entirely, referring instead to an unexpected on-air exchange. None of it felt real. Inside her dressing room, Rachel sat motionless on the floor. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, emails piled up, press requests, comment demands, crisis teams. But she didn't move to answer. Her fingers were wrapped around the edge of a photo frame. The image of Mia on her lap. She whispered the name again. This time, it didn't catch in her throat. She remembered Mia's giggle. The way she always asked for extra syrup on her pancakes. The way she held Rachel's hand during thunderstorms. Rachel squeezed the photo tight, her eyes brimming again. This wasn't about her show anymore, or ratings, or even reputation. It was about the silence she'd carried for 20 years, and how that silence had just been exposed to the world by a man who understood exactly what it meant. Rachel placed the photo back on the table and stood slowly. Her legs were unsteady, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She walked to the mirror, not to fix her makeup, but to face herself. Truly, the woman in the reflection looked exhausted. Not from scandal or stress, but from years of pretending. Years of pushing down the ache, of hiding behind scripts, sarcasm, and applause. The truth was, Rachel had been grieving long before that night with Keanu, grieving in silence, alone, and that silence had finally caught up with her. A knock came again at the door. "Rachel?" her assistant called softly. "They're asking if you want to come out. They're ready to film whenever you are." She didn't answer right away. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. But instead of opening it, she turned and walked to the desk. She picked up a pen and a blank sheet of stationery. The same stationery she had once used to write thank you notes from Mia's hospital room. The same design. Sunflowers on the corner. She began to write. Not a script. Not a statement. But a letter. A letter to her daughter. She didn't know if she'd ever read it aloud. Didn't know if the world would ever see it. But in that moment, it wasn't about the world. It was about her. It was about finally telling the truth. Telling Mia she was sorry for staying silent, for hiding her memory away, for laughing at someone else's grief to protect herself from her own. The pen moved slowly at first, then faster. The words came in waves. Pain, guilt, love, regret, all pouring out. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time, from release. She folded the letter gently, set it beside the photo. Then, for the first time that day, she opened the door. Outside, the hallway was still. Her assistant looked up, surprised. Rachel gave a small nod. No words yet, just movement, just presence. She wasn't ready to speak to the cameras, but she was ready to feel again. And that, she realized, was the first step toward healing, not just for herself, but maybe for everyone who had seen what happened on that stage. Rachel Lennox sat in her living room alone. It was midnight. No cameras, no lights. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the quiet tapping of her fingers against the edge of her phone. She stared at the screen for a long time. The Go Live button waited, glowing softly like a challenge she wasn't sure she was strong enough to accept. She hadn't planned to say anything. Her team had begged her not to. But something inside her had shifted since writing that letter to Mia. It was like a window had opened, and the air that rushed in wasn't filled with panic. It was filled with truth. And she couldn't go back to hiding. She tapped the screen. Live. The counter started at 0, then 7, then 30. Within 60 seconds, it was in the thousands. Rachel didn't wear makeup. She hadn't rehearsed a single word. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes were still red. She wore a simple gray sweater and sat on her couch like any ordinary woman trying to breathe through pain. She didn't start with an apology. She didn't start with Keanu's name. She simply whispered, "I need to tell the truth." The comments began pouring in, but Rachel didn't read them. Her eyes stayed locked on the camera. She exhaled, shaky. "When I was 19, she said, I got pregnant. No one knew. Not my parents, not my friends. I was too scared, too young, too unsure of what kind of life I could give a child." She paused, her voice trembling. "I told myself I would figure it out, that I had time, but I didn't." The silence between her sentences felt heavier than the words themselves. "I lost the baby, alone. I never even saw her face. I never even told anyone her name." Her throat tightened. "I buried it. That moment. That grief. I buried it so deep I convinced myself it wasn't real. I put all my energy into becoming someone else. Someone smart, sharp, funny. Someone who couldn't be touched." She wiped her cheek quickly, almost angrily. "And every time someone brought up grief or pain or loss on my show, I joked, I jabbed, I covered it with laughter. Because if I laughed at them, I didn't have to remember her." The number of live viewers doubled. Rachel's voice cracked. So when Keanu sat across from me and I said what I said, it wasn't really about him. I need you all to know that. I wasn't mocking him. She looked directly into the lens, eyes glossy, hands trembling slightly. I was mocking the grief I never faced. Rachel paused to breathe, her chest rising and falling slowly. She didn't reach for a tissue. She didn't try to compose herself. Her silence was part of the message. It gave people space to feel with her. There's something that happens when you don't mourn properly, she continued. You become a version of yourself that's constantly defending against the world. You walk through life armored up. And sometimes that armor becomes cruelty. She blinked, staring at a spot on the floor. Her voice softened. I've made a career out of being quick, out of turning vulnerability into punchlines. I've interviewed presidents, rock stars, movie icons, and I always told myself, if I can make people laugh, I win. Her jaw clenched. But what do you win when the cost is your own soul? She looked back at the camera. I didn't just fail Keanu. I failed myself. I failed Mia. The name hung in the air. The chat box was exploding. Thousands of viewers were still watching, but Rachel didn't read a single comment. This wasn't a conversation. It was a confession. She reached beside her and held up the photo frame from her dressing room. The image of her holding baby Mia in the hospital. Her eyes in the photo looked different. Younger, but also older in some way. Like the weight of what was coming had already settled into her bones. This is real, Rachel whispered. She was real. She set the photo down. And I think, in some twisted way, I lashed out at Keanu because he never stopped honoring the realness of his loss. He never made it a joke. He never tried to erase it. He wore it, quietly and with grace. Her eyes brimmed again. When he touched that necklace, I knew. She swallowed hard. I knew I had crossed a line that had nothing to do with television, nothing to do with ratings or sarcasm or performance. I had pierced something sacred. She held her breath for a long second before speaking again. I don't expect forgiveness, not from him, not from any of you. But I couldn't move forward without telling you who I am behind this show, behind the voice, behind the stage makeup and applause. The chat flooded with hearts and crying emojis, but Rachel never looked away from the lens. I'm not asking to be uncancelled, she said quietly. I'm asking to finally stop pretending. The stream remained silent for a moment longer. Then she leaned forward. There's a little girl who would be 21 this year, she whispered, and I've missed every birthday, every moment. But tonight I finally said her name out loud. She let the silence linger. Then she leaned back and sighed, wiping her face with both hands. Her cheeks were blotchy, her nose red, but her voice had steadied. Grief doesn't go away just because you get successful, she said. It waits. And when you ignore it long enough, it finds its way out, through jokes, through cruelty, through silence. She looked around the room. The camera was still rolling, the viewer count still climbing. I don't want to hide anymore, she continued. Not from you, not from myself. She paused, then added, and not from her. Rachel reached for something out of frame. It was a small white candle. She lit it carefully, then set it on the table in front of her. From Mia, she whispered. She didn't explain, she didn't elaborate, she didn't need to. Then she looked back at the camera one last time. To anyone out there carrying something unspoken, I see you, she said. I was you. And tonight, I chose not to run anymore. With a simple motion, she ended the live stream. There was no music, no outro, no applause. But across the internet, the world paused, not to attack, not to cancel, but to feel. The internet was still processing Rachel Lennox's emotional live stream when something else surfaced. Something that made the entire story darker. It began as a whisper, a vague tweet from a burner account. Check the audio, They planned it. Most people ignored it at first. Rumors are easy to come by, especially in media scandals. But within hours, a clip was leaked to a small but reputable journalist collective. The clip was barely 2 minutes long, recorded inside a closed-door production meeting the day before the show aired. It was grainy, low quality, but the voices were unmistakable. One voice stood out clearly. It belonged to a senior producer. "Push him," the voice said. "He won't fight back. That's his brand. Calm, humble, broken. The audience eats that stuff up." Another voice, lower, chimed in. "We've got that cue card about the daughter. You want her to ask that?" There was a short pause, then laughter. "She'll land it. He'll just sit there with those sad puppy eyes. It's perfect. Viral gold." The clip ended with a casual comment about camera angles and lighting, but the damage had already been done. Within minutes, the audio went viral. This wasn't just a talk show segment gone wrong. It wasn't just a poorly timed joke or a lapse in judgment. This was planned, scripted, executed with the cold precision of entertainment strategy. And suddenly, everyone knew it. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Pushed for pain. Grief is not content. They planned it. Influencers who had defended Rachel were now deleting their tweets. Podcasters who had questioned whether Keanu was overreacting released apology clips. The tide turned fast, and it was no longer just about Rachel Lennox. It was about the machine behind her. People demanded answers. Who wrote that cue card? Who approved the segment? And most importantly, why did they think it was okay? The silence from the network was deafening. By the next morning, an anonymous former intern posted screenshots on Reddit. They showed a shared document labeled Keanu Interview Segment, Shock Beat Options. Inside, under a bulleted list titled Potential Emotional Pokes, one line was highlighted in yellow. Mention deceased daughter. Frame as imaginary for maximum discomfort. "This is great," Walden. The user captioned it simply, "This was the culture." The post received over 80,000 upvotes in 6 hours. Journalists began reaching out. The intern, who went by the username Inside Green Room, shared more. Internal emails, Slack conversations, and notes from past meetings where producers brainstormed emotional ambushes disguised as improv moments. One note read, "People cry equals people click." The most chilling line, though, came from a team-wide memo. "Remind Rachel, Keanu's emotional stillness makes him the perfect foil. Lean into the contrast." By lunchtime, major news outlets were running the story. It had shifted from celebrity gossip to cultural indictment. The idea that pain could be packaged, edited, and sold so easily was no longer tolerable. The system wasn't just flawed, it was exposed. A well-known trauma psychologist went live on national TV. "This isn't entertainment," she said firmly. "This is emotional exploitation. And what's worse, it was engineered." Her statement was shared widely. That afternoon, a trending video montage surfaced across TikTok and YouTube. It spliced moments from other talk show segments where celebrities had clearly been blindsided, humiliated, or emotionally overwhelmed. The background music was haunting. The clips were damning. Keanu's silent stare from the night of the interview was now the symbol. Overlaying the footage were words in white. He knew he still stayed silent. It was no longer a story about one man's grief being mocked. It had become a mirror held up to the entire entertainment industry, and the reflection wasn't pretty. That evening, the network finally released a public statement. It came via a single tweet and a press release posted on their official website. "We deeply regret the emotional distress caused during last night's broadcast. We are launching an internal review and reaffirm our commitment to respectful storytelling and guest dignity." It was polished, cold, sterile. The wording, emotional distress, last night's broadcast, internal review, felt deliberately distant. There was no mention of Keanu Reeves by name, no apology, no accountability, just vague assurances and industry jargon. The internet reacted swiftly. Thousands of replies filled the comment sections. Has a name. This wasn't distress. It was exploitation. Pain isn't a segment. Within hours, the tweet was ratioed. The network's brand accounts went silent. Commenting was disabled on their platforms. But it was too late. The public had moved beyond shock and sympathy. Now came the scrutiny. Former employees, many anonymous at first, began coming forward. A former assistant writer recalled being told to search for soft spots in guest bios. Another said their pitch for a heartwarming segment about a guest charity work was rejected because it lacked emotional teeth. A third whistleblower revealed an internal slide deck from a network training session. One slide read, "Sad sells, crafting moments that stick." Another bullet point, "Emotion trumps substance. If it bleeds, it leads. If it weeps, it trends." The deck had been circulated for years, passed around like a marketing Bible. Every producer knew it, every host saw it. It was baked into the culture. The public had enough. Keanu's quote, "Some names deserve silence, not jokes," became more than a sentence. It became a movement. Artists painted murals of the moment. He touched his necklace. Writers published essays on dignity in grief. Grieving parents posted tributes online, thanking him for holding space, for not striking back. He said nothing more. But people heard him everywhere. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, chaos brewed. The network's board demanded emergency meetings. Sponsors pulled ads from not only Rachel's show, but other programs on the same network, unwilling to be associated with what had been exposed. Legal teams scrambled. Internal memos warned of liability. And still, Rachel said nothing. Not because she was silenced, but because she finally understood the cost of not listening. For the first time in her career, the punchline wasn't hers to deliver. She watched the wave of pain she had unintentionally unleashed, now expanded by the truths emerging from her own workplace. And she couldn't deny it anymore. It hadn't been an accident. The silence Keanu carried with grace, others were now forced to sit in, with shame, discomfort, and overdue reflection. The morning after the leaked audio shook the industry, Keanu arrived on the set of his latest independent film. It was a modest production, shooting in a quiet part of Vancouver, far from the chaos of Hollywood. There were no press cameras, no security detail. Just fog, pine trees, and a skeleton crew preparing for a sunrise shot. A local reporter, one of the few who knew about the shoot, had waited outside since dawn. As Keanu exited the trailer, coffee in hand and scarf wrapped around his neck, the reporter stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't shove a mic in his face. She simply asked, "Did you have any response to the backlash from the talk show incident?" He stopped walking. There was a pause, long and natural. Then he glanced upward for a moment, as if searching for the right words, not in his head but in his heart. "I hope she heals," he said softly. No press conference, no tweet storm, just 5 words. By the time he reached set, the line had already been posted, first as a caption on a behind-the-scenes photo, then as a quote tweet, then as a headline. Keanu Reeves, "I hope she heals." It wasn't performative, it wasn't crafted for damage control. It didn't center himself, it didn't demand justice. It extended grace to someone who didn't deserve it but clearly needed it. Social media paused again. Comment after comment flooded in. This man teaches by example. Who else could respond with that level of kindness? Well, he didn't destroy her, he reminded her she's human. One user wrote, "The same man who sat in silence now speaks a sentence the world needs to hear." And then he said no more. No follow-up quote, no clarification. His team didn't issue any corrections. There was no media tour. The only thing that changed was the direction of the public conversation. Where there had once been outrage, now there was a strange kind of stillness. People who had been arguing online about Rachel's punishment now began posting about their own regrets, their own cruel jokes, the moments they had missed the chance to show someone grace. One man shared that after seeing Keanu's response, he finally reached out to his estranged sister after years of silence. Another said he called his father after decades of anger just to say, "I hope you're okay." The ripple effect was no longer about Rachel. It was about everyone. In a world trained to react, Keanu had chosen something else entirely: restraint, humility, and the hope of healing. And he wasn't finished yet. Later that same week, while media outlets continued spinning stories and reactions, Keanu made a quiet stop at a children's hospital just outside Los Angeles. No press followed him there. There were no red carpets or curated social media posts, just a man in a soft beanie, carrying a tote bag full of coloring books, small action figures, and books in multiple languages. He had been visiting the hospital off and on for over a year, always without announcement. The staff knew to keep it low profile. His name wasn't listed on the guest log under celebrity visitors. It was written as K. Charles, a nod to his middle name. This time, though, something was different. The nurses noticed it in the way Keanu moved. Slower, more introspective. When he knelt beside a young girl named Lena, who had been battling leukemia since age 6, he took off his cap and let her put colorful stickers all over his forehead and cheeks. She giggled and asked why he wasn't in a movie today. He smiled, touching one of the butterfly stickers. "Because right now, I'd rather be here." No camera recorded the moment, but a nurse walking by heard it and later wrote about it in a Facebook post. It went viral within hours, not because it was flashy, but because it felt sacred. The post read, "I watched a man who has carried unimaginable grief kneel down to carry someone else's. No fanfare, just kindness. That's real strength." In another room, Keanu read aloud to a nonverbal boy with cerebral palsy. No words came back, but the boy's mother said her son's eyes widened and fixed on Keanu for a full minute. That had never happened before. Keanu didn't say anything about it. He just held the boy's hand for a while, thumb gently brushing over tiny fingers. Back in the hallway, a volunteer asked Keanu if he was doing okay. He nodded and said, "I'm just trying to bring peace, wherever it's allowed." The volunteer, not expecting anything so profound, just smiled and whispered, "You already are." As he left the hospital that afternoon, a few parents gathered near the entrance. They didn't ask for selfies. One simply thanked him, another handed him a folded note. He didn't open it right away. He waited until he got into his car, parked down the street to avoid attention. Then, in the silence of the driver's seat, he unfolded the paper. It read, "You reminded us what grace looks like. Thank you for not shouting. Thank you for feeling." He tucked the note into his coat pocket, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and just breathed. That breath, that quiet moment, was the only statement he would give that day. By the next morning, people weren't talking about Rachel's cruelty. They were talking about Keanu's grace. His words, "I hope she heals," echoed across social media, not as a quote, but as a reflection. A quiet call to be better. The phrase appeared on bracelets and posters, in journal entries, and under posts about personal loss. It didn't trend because it was clever. It stayed because it felt like truth. Keanu made no further comment. Instead, he disappeared from the spotlight and reappeared somewhere entirely different, a pediatric hospice in Minnesota. No cameras, no press, just a man who sat with children too weak to speak and parents too numb to cry. He didn't tell them to be strong. He just sat with them. That was enough. At a tiny poetry night in San Diego, Keanu listened quietly in the back. A woman read a piece about the child she lost decades ago. After the event, he approached her and said, "Your words carry a life. Someone needed to hear them tonight." Then he walked out before she could ask for anything more. In New York, he showed up at a support group for fathers who had buried children. He wasn't on the guest list. He didn't give a speech, he just listened, hands folded, eyes soft. One man later shared, "He made space for our pain without asking us to explain it." Meanwhile, major networks kept pressing for a formal statement. Keanu's team declined every time. "He's not interested in clearing the air," his publicist finally said, "because the air is already clear." That one line silenced even the loudest voices in the media. People didn't want a scandal anymore. They wanted stillness. Keanu wasn't seeking vindication. He never mentioned Rachel again. He simply kept moving, walking through places no one expected him to be. Always where someone was hurting. Always leaving quietly. When a journalist finally caught up with him outside a shelter in Los Angeles and asked how he was feeling about everything, Keanu only smiled. "Pain is a strange teacher," he said, "but if you don't run from it, sometimes it hands you back your heart." He didn't stay for more questions. That was the last public comment he made. In the end, Keanu didn't shut down the host with anger. He didn't clap back. He didn't cancel anyone. He showed the world a different way to respond. One rooted not in dominance, but in dignity. And people noticed. Because grace doesn't demand attention, it earns it. And sometimes, the quietest man in the room leaves the loudest legacy. It started quietly. In a high school ethics class in Oregon, a teacher played the clip. Not to shock the students, not to spark outrage, but to ask a question. What do we owe each other when someone shows pain? The class, usually restless by midweek, fell silent as Keanu touched his necklace, as Rachel laughed, then faltered, and as he whispered the line that would echo far beyond that studio, "Some names deserve silence." A boy in the back of the room raised his hand. "I think we all knew it wasn't funny, but we waited for someone else to say something." That moment repeated in classrooms across the country, not as curriculum, as caution. College professors paused their regular lectures to show the clip in their media ethics courses. They didn't assign blame. They asked students to write essays not on Rachel's failure, but on Keanu's response. Why did it resonate? Why did silence speak louder than a defense? In Tennessee, a seminary professor played the moment before a discussion on grace. A student wept through the entire class and later shared that she hadn't spoken to her father in years after he failed to show up at her child's funeral. The clip broke something open in her heart. She called him that night. Pastors across churches referenced the moment in Sunday sermons. One stood at his pulpit and asked, "How many of us would have sat still, head bowed, heart exposed, and said nothing at all, just to preserve someone else's dignity?" There was no sound in the pews. In Kansas, a grief support group leader used the clip to start their weekly circle. She didn't explain it. She pressed play. When it ended, no one needed to say what it meant. A young woman who hadn't spoken for 3 sessions finally broke her silence. She didn't talk about Keanu. She talked about her brother, about how his name hadn't been spoken in her house for 4 years. "I thought it meant they didn't care," she said, "but maybe they didn't know how." In New York, a meditation app added a new daily reflection. It was just one sentence, read over soft music. Some names deserve silence. They didn't credit Keanu directly. They didn't need to. People knew where it came from. And that one line, repeated in bedrooms and parks and morning commutes, grounded people in their own memories. It reminded them to pause. Not everything had to be responded to. Not every scar was meant to be seen. And slowly the conversation began to shift, not from rage to justice, but from noise to meaning. In a small public high school in Montana, Something unexpected happened during a morning advisory class. After watching Keanu's silent moment as part of an ethics lesson, a teenage boy, normally the loudest in the room, raised his hand. He didn't make a joke. He didn't roll his eyes. He just asked, "Why did that hit so hard?" His teacher, Ms. Jensen, was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Because that silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning." After class, the boy lingered behind. He told her he had lost his brother in a car accident 3 years ago, and no one ever talked about it at home. He said he never cried because he didn't think it would fix anything. But watching Keanu sit with the weight of grief without flinching, without deflecting, made something crack open inside him. She didn't push him, she just handed him a journal and said, "You don't need to explain, just write." He nodded and took it. In that moment, the lesson wasn't about Keanu Reeves anymore. It was about what his silence had unlocked. Similar stories popped up across the country. High school students stopped using edgy jokes to hide their discomfort. College professors in communications and media ethics classes introduced the clip as a discussion prompt under a new heading: "When silence speaks louder than spin." Debate teams analyzed the interview not for sound bites, but for what Keanu didn't say. They talked about how his refusal to defend himself made the audience lean in, how it turned the mirror outward, back onto the host, back onto the viewers. In a university chapel in New York, a theology professor paused his sermon mid-sentence. He set aside his notes and cued a short clip. The screen showed Keanu Reeves, still and silent, holding the silver cross around his neck. The congregation leaned forward, not to be entertained, but to feel something that couldn't be spoken. When the clip ended, the professor simply asked, "When was the last time you honored someone's name by not using it?" There was no answer, just stillness. In grief counseling centers across the country, therapists began referencing Keanu's moment as a breakthrough example, not as celebrity worship, but as a real, lived embodiment of how to hold space for pain. Clients who had resisted talking about loss found comfort knowing they weren't alone in their silence. That grief didn't always need to be explained. Sometimes it needed to be witnessed. 2-70-76-1003. April 70. One counselor, Lisa in Atlanta, started every group session with the phrase, "Some names deserved silence." And for the first time, some of her patients began opening up. Not with words, but by writing names on slips of paper and placing them in a glass bowl at the center of the circle. They didn't speak the names. They just nodded when ready. And others nodded back. Meanwhile, a meditation app quietly added a 5-minute reflection called Reverent Silence. It featured no narration, just still music and a prompt at the beginning. Think of the name that lives deepest in your heart. Let it echo without sound. The description credited Keanu Reeves. It exploded in popularity. By the end of the week, the clip from Rachel Lennox's show wasn't just viral. It was canon. Used in schools, in therapy, in prayer. It had slipped past scandal and entered something deeper. It became a cultural mirror. One that reflected how far society had drifted from empathy in pursuit of entertainment, and what it might mean to come back. Even satirical shows backed off. Late-night hosts known for their biting humor took a different tone. They didn't make fun of Rachel. They didn't parody Keanu. They played the clip without commentary, then paused. One host looked into the camera and said, "Maybe this is where we let silence speak for itself?" And for the first time in a long time, no punchline followed. What began as a cruel joke, intended to cut deep, had created something unexpected, a reset, a cultural check-in. And behind it all was a man who never raised his voice, never lashed out. Rachel Lennox hadn't left her apartment in over a week. The lights stayed off, the curtains remained drawn. Her phone buzzed every few minutes with alerts, mentions, messages. Most of them she didn't open. The noise of the outside world had become unbearable, not because people were yelling at her, but because they had stopped. The silence was worse than the anger. One morning, just after sunrise, Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, staring at a piece of toast she hadn't eaten. Her laptop screen was open, paused on the frame of herself mid-laugh, frozen in time at the exact moment the world changed. She pressed the spacebar, watched herself say the line, watched Keanu go silent, and saw the audience turn. She didn't cry, she just sat there. That same day, she walked to a church in a quiet part of the city, not for religion, for the basement. There, tucked away below the chapel, was a weekly grief support group that didn't advertise. No cameras, no introductions, no expectations. Just a circle of chairs and a sign on the door that read, "You are not broken, you are breathing." Rachel took a seat in the back, said nothing. She sat in silence for an hour while others spoke. A father grieving his son, a nurse grieving her mother, a teenager grieving his best friend. Rachel's mouth never moved. She came back the next week, still silent. By the fourth week, people had gotten used to her. They didn't ask why she was there. They didn't recognize her, most of them anyway. And if they did, they didn't let on. Rachel listened. Every word pierced her. Every tear mirrored something she had buried long ago. Then came the sixth week. She walked in carrying a small cardboard box. She placed it on her lap. Her hands trembled as she opened the lid. Inside were sheets of paper, dozens of them, each with a joke she had written about death, pain, or tragedy. Old stand-up bits, scripted monologues, late-night zingers that once got applause, things she had once thought were clever, sharp, even healing. She looked around the circle. Her voice cracked as she spoke for the first time. "I used to think laughter was strength," she said quietly. "I thought if I could make people laugh at grief, maybe I could control mine." She pulled out one paper and read the line. No one laughed. She folded it again and said, "But I think silence might be stronger." For a moment, no one responded. Then a hand reached across the circle. It was an older woman named Judith who had lost her brother the year before. She handed Rachel a small folded note. Rachel opened it. It read, "You do not have to be whole to begin healing." She didn't say anything else. She just nodded. For the first time in years, the mask began to crack. Not with shame, but with honesty. Rachel didn't go home after the meeting. She wandered through dimly lit streets until her feet carried her to an old diner she hadn't visited in years. The red booths and greasy smell hadn't changed. It felt like stepping into a memory. She slid into a booth, placing the worn box of jokes beside her. A waitress approached. "Long night?" she asked kindly. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, the kind that doesn't end when you go to bed." The woman poured her some tea, then walked away without another word. Rachel sat in silence, staring at the cup. She opened the box and pulled out one of the slips of paper. A joke she once made on national television about miscarriage. She remembered how the audience laughed, how proud she felt for being so bold. Now, reading it made her chest tighten. Without thinking, she dipped the joke into her tea. The ink bled out slowly, disappearing into the warm liquid. She watched it fade like smoke. She repeated the process. One by one, she took the jokes and let them dissolve in silence. The diner was nearly empty, and no one asked what she was doing. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't for show. It was a quiet moment of release. By the time her tea was cold, the box was empty. The next morning, she returned to the support group. She didn't bring anything. No papers, no words prepared. When it was her turn to speak, she took a breath. "I always thought making people laugh made the pain smaller," she said. "But I think silence might be stronger." There was no applause, no reaction, just listening. And for once, she didn't need anything more. Rachel lingered after the meeting ended. Most of the chairs had been stacked, and the room was nearly empty. She sat still, unsure if she felt lighter or just quieter inside. A woman approached her gently. She looked to be in her 60s, calm and steady. Without saying a word, she handed Rachel a folded piece of paper. Rachel opened it slowly. The note read, "You do not have to be whole to begin healing." She stared at it for a moment, then pressed it to her chest. The woman didn't wait for thanks. She simply nodded and walked away. Rachel folded the note carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night she read it again, then again the next morning. It stayed with her, a quiet reminder that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting its presence and choosing to live anyway. Over the next few weeks, Rachel didn't return to television. She refused interviews, declined statements. The network released a brief message about an extended leave, and the noise of speculation moved on. Rachel didn't. Instead, she started volunteering at a local grief center. She registered under her middle name, no cameras, no attention, just small acts of help, folding blankets, bringing tea, sitting quietly. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. One evening, during a support session, a young woman clutched a drawing her late brother had made. Her hands were shaking. Rachel reached into her coat and handed the note to her. The girl unfolded it slowly, read it, and whispered, "Did someone give this to you too?" Rachel nodded once. The girl folded it again and tucked it into her journal. "I'll pass it on someday," she said. Rachel smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't reach the lips but lives deep in the chest. That's how it began, quiet, unseen, human. Not with a redemption tour, not with applause. The employee. Just one moment of understanding. Rachel kept returning to the grief center, not to fix others, not to erase what she had done, but to be present. And in those quiet rooms, week after week, she learned something she had never let herself believe. That silence is not weakness. That grief is not shame. That broken people can still offer healing. And that sometimes, not saying anything at all is the most powerful thing you can do. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of her refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. For weeks, she had avoided writing. Every time she picked up a pen, her hand would tremble slightly and the words would vanish from her mind. But tonight was different. She didn't need a perfect sentence. She just needed honesty. She uncapped her pen and started to write. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a request for forgiveness. It was a thank you. 6 pages later, her handwriting had turned shaky. There were smudges where tears had fallen, and some words were crossed out and rewritten. She didn't try to make the letter sound polished. She didn't reread it. When she signed her name at the bottom, she didn't add a title or a return address. Just Rachel. She sealed the envelope and placed it gently in a plain manila package. Inside, she wrote one line on a small card. "I understand now. Thank you for letting the world see grief without shame." She didn't send it through her PR team. She didn't consult a manager. She found the fan mail address listed online for Keanu's team, usually reserved for autograph requests and movie posters, and mailed it herself from the local post office. She expected nothing in return. Weeks passed. Spring faded into early summer. Rachel returned to her quiet routines. She read more, walked often, and kept volunteering at the center. She didn't think about the letter every day, but every now and then she wondered if he had read it, or if it had even arrived. Then one morning there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a small package on her doorstep. No name, no postage stamp, just her address, handwritten neatly across the top. Inside, there was no letter, no signature, just a photograph. It was a black and white image, slightly weathered at the edges. Keanu was standing alone in front of a modest headstone. His back was turned to the camera, one hand resting in his jacket pocket. In the other, he held a single white flower. Pressed gently into the back of the photo was a real flower. Dried now, delicate, and carefully sealed. Taped beneath it was a small note in simple print. "You were never laughing alone." Rachel held the photo for a long time, seated on the edge of her couch with the package still open beside her. Her fingers traced the edge of the dried flower pressed into the back. It felt too fragile to touch, too sacred to fully understand. She didn't cry, not right away. The emotion was quieter than that, like a tide rolling in without sound. She studied the photograph again. Keanu's posture wasn't posed, it wasn't for attention, it was simply real. The way he stood, shoulders slightly curved inward, the white flower hanging gently in his hand, told a story more profound than anything she had seen on a screen. She had once mocked his silence. Now it was his silence that spoke the most. Her hand trembled as she set the photo down on the coffee table. She leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The words kept echoing in her mind. "You were never laughing alone." Not an accusation, not a reprimand, an invitation, an acknowledgement, a thread of shared humanity. Rachel walked over to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in long, quiet stripes across the floor. Everything felt different now. Not heavier, but more honest. She picked up the envelope she had used to send her letter and placed it next to the photograph. They belonged together now. Two pieces of a conversation that had never needed to be spoken aloud. Later that day, she went back to the grief support center. She carried the photo with her in a small protective sleeve. During the circle, she didn't speak about who had sent it. She didn't talk about what she had done on national television. She just said this: "Sometimes the most unexpected reply is the one that doesn't demand attention. It simply arrives and changes everything." After the meeting, a woman approached her. She looked at the photo carefully, then at Rachel. "Did someone really send this to you?" the woman asked gently. Rachel nodded. The woman hesitated, then said, "It's the kind of thing that stays with you, isn't it?" "Yes," Rachel said quietly. "It doesn't shout. It just stays." She didn't explain who Keanu was. She didn't bring up his name. The story was bigger than just him or her. It was about the small acts that carried weight. The way grief could bend and still not break someone. The way silence could reach across miles and years, deeper than words ever could. And it was still unfolding. That evening, Rachel placed the photograph on a quiet corner of her bookshelf. Not for display, but for presence. She didn't frame it or show it to guests. It was simply there, resting between a worn journal and a flickering candle she hadn't lit in years. The pressed flower behind the photo remained untouched. She read the note one more time. "You were never laughing alone." Those 6 words had unraveled something inside her. Not guilt. She had already faced that. It was deeper. Recognition. She had spent years trying to outpace pain with laughter, running from something she never dared name. Now, someone had seen her clearly, without judgment, without praise, and it changed everything. She didn't go back on air. She didn't give interviews. Her manager tried to convince her to write a memoir to share her healing journey, but Rachel said no. Some things, she now believed, were meant to be private. She joined a new grief circle, one where no one knew who she was. There, she simply listened. And when she finally spoke, it was just to say this: sometimes we carry grief so long we forget how to set it down. That photo reminded me how the room was quiet. No one asked for details. No one needed to. In the weeks that followed, something strange began happening across the country. Something no one could have predicted from a single moment of silence on a talk show. Late-night hosts started writing their monologues differently. The sarcasm was still there, But the cruelty was dialed back. They poked fun at the usual headlines, but there were fewer jokes at the expense of someone's pain. Writers' rooms, once buzzing with pressure to deliver shock value, began asking a new question: is it worth it? In stand-up comedy clubs, performers took longer pauses. Some even opened their sets by talking gently about grief, not to make fun of it, but to acknowledge that it lived in every room. The audience didn't heckle. They listened. Churches and community centers, from small Midwest towns to coastal cities, started introducing a moment of silence before gatherings, not out of tradition, out of recognition. Pastors quoted Keanu's line, "Some names deserve silence," not as a pop culture reference, but as a principle. Social media reflected the shift. Instead of clapping back or canceling, people began sharing stories. The hashtag #SomeNamesDeserveSilence had started as a reaction. Now it was a movement. People posted photos of loved ones they'd lost, sometimes with just a name and a candle emoji. No captions, no explanations, just presence. Tattoo artists noticed something too. A shop in Brooklyn reported a spike in requests for a single word: stillness. Another, in Austin, showed arms inked with Keanu's quote, "Some names." One client explained, "It's not about him, it's about everyone we've lost, and how we carry them." At a high school in Oregon, a sophomore named Elijah stood in front of his class and gave a presentation about courage. He didn't talk about superheroes or generals. He pulled up a still image from the now infamous interview, the moment Keanu sat silently, hand resting on his necklace. "This," Elijah said, voice steady, "is the man who didn't fight back, and still won." His teacher wiped away tears. No one laughed. Keanu had not spoken since his quiet comment on set. No interviews, no follow-ups. But somehow his silence had become a kind of mirror. It reflected not just his own pain, but everyone else's. The world looked into that stillness and saw itself. Bookstores quietly rearranged their shelves. A new table appeared in the corner, labeled Grief and Growth. Not self-help, not pop psychology, just books about loss, healing, and the stories people never told out loud until now. Therapists noticed something too. Clients didn't ask for quick fixes, they asked for space. A counselor in Denver shared, "People sit down now and say, 'Can we not talk yet?' And I say, 'Yes.'" At a tech company's annual meeting, the usual flashy presentation was replaced with one image, a list of names. Employees who'd lost loved ones that year. There was no speech, just a minute of silence. Some cried, others closed their eyes. No one checked their phones. A viral podcast released a special episode called "The Day Silence Won." Guests talked about the first time they felt seen, not through words, but through the absence of them. A hospice nurse said, "Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything we've been carrying." One university created a class on the ethics of grief in media. The Keanu clip wasn't just discussed, it was studied. Not for what was said, but for what wasn't. And in one quiet barbershop in Michigan, a handwritten sign appeared. "Haircuts in silence. If you need it, just nod." In a small town outside St. Louis, the local high school held its annual Heroes Assembly. Students usually chose firefighters, soldiers, or athletes. But this year, something different happened. A quiet student named Maya stepped onto the stage, holding a printed still frame from that unforgettable talk show. Keanu Reeves, sitting in silence, one hand resting on his chest. No caption, no filter, just the image. She took a breath and said, "I didn't know who I wanted to be when I grew up. But then I saw someone who showed me that strength doesn't always mean standing up. Sometimes it means staying still." The gymnasium was quiet. A few teachers wiped tears from their eyes. No applause, Not yet. Just stillness. That image was later framed and hung in the school's counseling office. Below it, a quote typed on white paper. He didn't defend himself. He defended something bigger. Churches continued opening their services with silence, not as a moment of prayer, but as a gesture of space, for the people who didn't know what they needed yet. And on the walls of coffee shops, tattoo studios, subway tunnels, and university bathrooms, 3 simple words kept reappearing, handwritten or carved or inked. Some names. Deserve. Not even the full phrase, just the beginning. People finished it in their own minds, or didn't, because somehow everyone knew what it meant. Influencers stopped trying to trend over it. They couldn't. The moment had become untouchable. Not because it was viral, but because it was sacred. Talk show hosts, who once lived on shock and scandal, started asking guests how they were really doing. One even aired a segment called Before the Joke, where guests were given the choice to skip any question. Ratings didn't drop. They climbed. The world hadn't become perfect. Outrage still existed. Cruelty hadn't vanished. But something had shifted. A line had been drawn, softly but permanently. Kindness had become visible again. Not flashy, not hashtagged, but lived. And all of it began with a man who said almost nothing at all, who sat there and let the world feel. Rachel Lennox returned to the studio just after sunrise. No assistants, no makeup, no crew. The doors opened with a heavy groan that echoed off the empty walls. The place that once buzzed with energy, lights, and nervous laughter now felt like a cathedral without a congregation. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked across the stage she once ruled. Rows of empty seats faced her, silent and still. The laughter track machine had been unplugged days ago. No more cues to smile, no producers barking lines through an earpiece, just her and the stillness. She sat in the same chair where Keanu had sat weeks earlier. The memory of that moment hovered in the air. She didn't try to fight it. She didn't look away. A single camera had been set up, static, no angles, no cuts, just a straight-on view of the center stage. She had arranged for it herself, insisting on no one else being in the building. There would be no audience, no second take. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. And for the first 10 minutes, she didn't speak. The silence was not accidental. It was deliberate. A mirror held up to everything that had come before. The jokes, the headlines, the spiraling noise. She let the stillness stretch out, not as a stunt, but as a confession. Somewhere outside the studio, viewers across the country sat frozen in their living rooms. They had tuned in expecting something different. Maybe a speech, maybe an apology, maybe another viral soundbite. Instead, they were met with absence. And slowly, as the quiet held its shape, people began to understand what was happening. Rachel wasn't returning to reclaim anything. She wasn't looking for redemption. She was offering something rare in modern television. A pause, a space, an invitation. At the 10-minute mark, she opened her eyes and looked directly into the lens. Her voice didn't project. It didn't command. It simply arrived. Welcome back to the space where we stopped pretending. That was it. No closing monologue, no musical guest, no sponsors. The network didn't add credits or commentary. When the feed ended, it cut to black. No encore, no repost, no social media clips. Just one broadcast. And yet, those 12 words rippled out like thunder across a quiet valley. The morning after the broadcast, the network received thousands of unexpected messages. Not angry emails, not social media noise, just voicemails. Many silent, some filled with tears, others leaving a single phrase, "Thank you for that." One woman called and said, "I lost my father 2 weeks ago. No one knew what to say. But Rachel's silence? It finally gave me permission to feel." Another message simply said, "We need more spaces like that." No hashtags, no trending topics, just people talking to each other, not for views or applause, but for understanding. Across the country, screenshots quietly circulated. Rachel alone on stage. No makeup, no spotlight tricks, just her and the stillness. Underneath the image, words, handwritten by someone watching at home. This is what healing looks like. Churches mentioned it during Sunday service, not to preach, but to pause. In one rural chapel, the pastor played the broadcast in place of his sermon. He then said, "Let's just sit with what we saw." In classrooms and kitchens, in texts and quiet moments, people began saying it without explanation. "I'm in the space." It was a code for grief, honesty, or just needing a break from pretending. And people understood it. No one asked Rachel to return, and she didn't need to. Weeks later, the studio doors remained locked. Dust began to settle on equipment that once hummed with nightly energy. The chairs sat in perfect rows, untouched, as if waiting for laughter that would never come. There were quiet rumors that the show might resume with a new host or take a new direction entirely, but nothing was confirmed. And somehow, that felt right. Rachel never returned to that building again. Instead, she spent her mornings walking through city parks, unnoticed. She wore a plain gray sweater, hair tied back, eyes soft with something new, clarity. People recognized her, but rarely approached. When they did, it was not to criticize or idolize, but to share something vulnerable. One man stopped her near a bench and said, "My wife died last year. I watched your silence. I didn't even realize how much noise I was carrying until then." Rachel placed a hand over her heart and nodded. No words exchanged. Just that. She wasn't trying to rebuild a brand or launch a comeback. The industry had already moved on. New headlines, new outrage cycles. But her clip, those 10 minutes of silence and one sentence, remained untouched, like a monument no one dared to edit. An editor at a media publication wrote a short column titled, "The Show That Ended Without Ending." In it, she said, Rachel Lennox didn't walk away from the stage. She let the stage become something else. In unexpected corners of the country, small things began to change. A radio host started his morning segment with 30 seconds of silence. A high school teacher replaced a Monday quiz with a quiet writing session. Write the thing you've never said out loud. Some shows imitated the format. Quiet openings, stripped-down interviews, but few felt authentic, because what happened that night wasn't scripted. It wasn't designed for impact. It was just a human being reaching a breaking point and choosing stillness over spectacle. Rachel's face stopped appearing in celebrity magazines. Her name slipped from the trending tabs. But people remembered the feeling she left behind. A quiet resonance, a collective breath, and maybe that was enough. Sometimes, the most powerful moment in someone's career isn't the applause at their peak. It's the silence after they stop pretending. A soft morning light drifted through the windows of the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. It was quiet, not because people were whispering, but because peace had settled there, like a presence. In the pediatric oncology wing, nurses moved gently through the hallways. Art made by tiny hands covered the walls. Scribbled hearts, stars, animals with uneven smiles. And that day, Keanu Reeves walked those halls, not as a celebrity, but as a listener. He didn't carry a camera crew, no interviews, no press, just a gray hoodie, a small paper bag of chocolates, and time. Real time. The kind most people didn't give. He stopped in one room where a boy named Max, age 7, was recovering after another difficult treatment. Max had big glasses that slid down his nose and a pile of colored pencils next to his pillow. When Keanu entered, Max didn't say much. He just looked up, nodded once, and went back to his drawing. Keanu sat beside the bed and didn't try to fill the space with conversation. He just watched. After a few minutes, Max pushed the paper toward him and said, "This is you." Keanu looked down. The drawing showed a stage. On the left side stood a tall figure labeled Keanu, wearing a simple black shirt. On the right, an empty chair. On the chair, written in uneven crayon letters, were the words, "I'm sorry." Keanu blinked. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pretend to understand everything the boy had gone through. But he placed his hand over the paper gently, nodded, and said, "That's the most honest art I've ever seen." Max smiled. A small one, like it took effort. But it was real. A nurse, watching from the doorway, wiped her eyes. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was soft, quiet. Just a man sitting beside a boy who had seen too much, honoring a picture with more truth than 1,000 news stories. After a few minutes, Max added one more thing. He whispered, "I saw your clip. My sister died. People joked about it, but you didn't." Keanu didn't speak. He just reached into his pocket and placed something next to Max's drawing. It was a tiny silver pin, shaped like a flame. "It belonged to someone who made me brave," Keanu said. "Now it's yours." Months passed. The noise faded. But something else remained. Not a scandal, not a trend, a shift. Keanu kept showing up, in quiet corners, away from headlines. A children's art center in Brooklyn reported he stopped by to drop off supplies. A grief retreat in Utah said he sent blank journals with a note, "Your story matters." He didn't sign his name. More people began to follow his example. At a comedy club in Chicago, the night opened with 10 seconds of silence. The host, known for edgy jokes, stepped out and said, "Some names deserve stillness." No laughter, just breath. Then the show began, softer somehow. A mural appeared in downtown Portland. It showed Keanu standing under a soft spotlight next to that empty chair with "I'm sorry" painted across the backrest. The quote below read, "He never raised his voice, but we heard him anyway." And in one quiet ceremony, a group of parents gathered in a hospital chapel. No schedule, no speeches, just space. On a small table sat a drawing. Keanu on stage beside the chair. A child's handwriting at the bottom read, "Thank you for not laughing." No one spoke. They didn't need to, because silence had finally said enough. The drawing Max gave Keanu didn't end up in a display case or a press kit. Instead, it was framed and quietly placed in the hallway near the pediatric oncology wing at the hospital. Just outside the art therapy room, it hung at a child's eye level. No fanfare, no label. Just the soft image of Keanu standing next to an empty chair with the words, "I'm sorry," drawn in a little boy's handwriting. Doctors and nurses passed it daily. Some slowed, others paused, and over time something strange happened. Children began asking about the chair. They weren't interested in fame or who Keanu Reeves was. They just wanted to know why someone would draw an empty seat with an apology. One nurse started including it in therapy sessions. She'd ask the children, "If you could place someone in that chair, who would it be?" The answers ranged from "my mom" to "the person who made fun of me" to "no one. I just want to sit there alone." The chair became a symbol, not of judgment, but of space, a visual permission slip for grief. A place where nothing had to be said, and everything was still understood. One teenager, quiet for weeks after losing her brother, left a folded note under the frame. The staff didn't open it for days, unsure if it was private. But finally, with the girl's permission, they read it aloud during group. It said, "I thought pain made me different, but then I saw that drawing, and I realized maybe being broken isn't the end. Maybe it's how we let others in." Word of the drawing spread, not through the media, but through caregivers and counselors. It began appearing in digital therapy guides, on laminated cards in support centers, even printed in grief workbooks as a journal prompt. Who would you place in the chair, and why? And still, Keanu never commented. He didn't repost the image. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't turn the moment into a brand or campaign. He let it belong to others. One day, a journalist reached out to the hospital, asking for permission to photograph the framed drawing for an upcoming piece. The staff declined. But they did pass along a message to her. This isn't a story for headlines. It's for healing. Years later, an author writing a book on grief visited the hospital and quietly asked to see the chair drawing. After a long pause in front of it, she said, "I think this is what happens when someone chooses dignity over defense." And the hallway stayed the same. The drawing never moved, but it kept speaking. To anyone who needed to be reminded that sometimes silence wasn't weakness. It was the highest form of strength. A place where grief could breathe, a place where apology didn't need explanation, a place where the world, just for a moment, remembered how to sit still and feel. Let me know if you're ready for the title suggestions, description, or Leonardo image prompts for this video.